Be me, 36, HR director at mid-sized software company with 180 employees across engineering, product, sales, and customer success departments. Had strong feminist beliefs about workplace culture, passionate about creating an environment where extroverted communication was valued and rewarded. Posted frequently on social media about importance of vocal participation and how silence in workplace indicated lack of engagement or contribution. Believed that employees who didn't speak up in meetings or participate actively in office culture weren't fully committed to company success. Got promoted to HR director specifically because CEO wanted culture transformation emphasizing collaboration, communication, and visible engagement. One of my first priorities was identifying employees who weren't participating actively in collaborative culture company was trying to build. Started observing team meetings, all-hands gatherings, and social events, noting which employees spoke frequently versus those who remained quiet. Senior software engineer named Nathan had been with company for 9 years managing critical infrastructure and database systems. Nathan was 42 years old, extremely quiet person who rarely spoke in meetings unless directly asked specific technical questions. Would sit through hour-long planning meetings without contributing verbally even when topics related to his systems and responsibilities. At company social events, Nathan would usually leave early or stay on periphery rather than actively networking with colleagues. During all-hands meetings, Nathan never asked questions or shared updates even when his infrastructure work was directly relevant. Started feeling concerned that Nathan's quietness indicated disengagement or lack of commitment to collaborative culture. Posted in HR forums about quiet employees who don't participate, asking if silence indicated performance or cultural problems. Got responses from other HR professionals saying quiet employees often weren't team players or were hiding inadequate performance. One HR director commented employees who don't speak up in meetings are usually not contributing at level you think they are. Another commented silence in workplace is red flag for disengagement. People committed to work want to share and collaborate. These responses confirmed my growing concern that Nathan's extreme quietness was problematic for company culture and performance. Called Nathan into meeting asking why he didn't participate more actively in meetings and company events. Nathan seemed uncomfortable explaining he was naturally introverted and preferred to listen and process before speaking. That he contributed through his infrastructure work and technical documentation rather than verbal participation in meetings. I said company valued vocal collaboration and that silence could be interpreted as lack of engagement or investment. That his quietness made it difficult for others to know what he was working on or how to collaborate with him. Nathan said his work was documented extensively in technical systems and available to anyone who needed information. That he responded promptly to all questions and requests, just preferred written communication over verbal meetings. I said verbal communication was an essential part of collaborative culture and his preference for writing wasn't acceptable. That he needed to speak up more in meetings, attend full social events, and be more visibly engaged with team. Nathan looked troubled, but said he'd try to participate more verbally despite it being uncomfortable for his working style. Over following 3 months, observed Nathan attempting to speak more in meetings, but contributions seemed forced and uncomfortable. Would occasionally share updates during stand-ups, but delivery was hesitant and brief compared to more extroverted colleagues. Attended one company happy hour, but spent most of time talking with just one other engineer before leaving after 45 minutes. During all hands, still didn't ask questions or volunteer information even when his infrastructure work was being discussed. Started feeling like Nathan's attempts to change were insufficient and that his fundamental quietness was cultural liability. Posted about employee who refuses to engage with collaborative culture despite multiple conversations about participation. Got responses saying some people just aren't good cultural fits and holding on to them hurts team morale and performance. One commenter said you've talked to him multiple times and he's not changing. That tells you he's not committed to culture. Another said quiet employees who can't adapt to collaborative environment should be moved out for team's benefit. For months after initial conversation with Nathan, called meetings saying I had serious concerns about his cultural fit. That despite conversations about participating more, he remained disengaged from meetings and company culture. That his quietness and preference for written over verbal communication wasn't aligned with collaborative values. Nathan seemed confused, asking if there were problems with his actual work performance or technical contributions. I said work performance wasn't the only metric. Cultural fit and collaborative engagement were equally important. That company needed employees who actively participated verbally, not just completed technical tasks in isolation. Nathan asked for specific examples of how his quietness had negatively impacted projects or team performance. I said impact wasn't always measurable, but his silence created perception that he wasn't fully engaged or committed. That other employees had mentioned feeling like they didn't know what Nathan was working on because he didn't share verbally. Nathan said everything he worked on was documented in technical systems with detailed notes and status updates. That teammates could access all information about his work anytime, but rarely checked documentation before asking him. I said expectation was that he'd share proactively in meetings, not require people to search for information in systems. 5 months after initial conversation, made decision to terminate Nathan's employment citing poor cultural fit. Told him that despite 9 years of service, his inability to adapt to collaborative culture meant he wasn't right fit going forward. That company needed employees who embraced verbal communication and active participation, not just technical competence. Nathan seemed devastated, asking if 9 years of maintaining critical infrastructure meant nothing compared to not talking in meetings. I said culture was as important as technical work, and his quietness was barrier to team collaboration and company values. Nathan asked for severance reflecting his 9 years of service and contributions to company's technical infrastructure. Offered standard 2-week severance, saying extended packages were for employees who'd been strong cultural contributors. He left that day after brief transition period, handing over documentation of infrastructure systems he'd been managing. Felt confident decision had been right for company culture, even though Nathan had been longtime employee. Posted on social media about tough decision to part ways with employee who couldn't adapt to collaborative culture we're building. Got supportive responses from HR professionals praising commitment to culture over just technical performance. Week after Nathan's termination, started receiving urgent messages from engineering team about critical systems issues. Database system Nathan had managed was experiencing performance problems that engineering team couldn't diagnose. Attempted to use Nathan's documentation to troubleshoot, but found issue was complex edge case not covered in standard procedures. Reached out to Nathan asking if he could consult on problem. He politely declined, saying he was no longer employed. Engineering team spent 3 days attempting to resolve database issue, eventually requiring expensive outside consultant. Consultant fixed problem but charged $15,000 and identified several other potential issues in infrastructure Nathan had been managing. 2 weeks after termination, another critical system failure occurred in authentication infrastructure Nathan had maintained. Engineering team again struggled to diagnose problem without Nathan's deep knowledge of system architecture and edge cases. This time resolution took 5 days, with system degradation affecting customer experience and causing service complaints. Started hearing from engineering leadership that Nathan's departure had created serious knowledge gaps in critical infrastructure. That his documentation was comprehensive for standard operations, but didn't capture years of edge cases and system quirks. 3 weeks after termination, major infrastructure failure occurred, requiring complete system restoration from backups. Engineering team discovered restoration process had specific steps Nathan had never documented because he'd always handled it personally. Restoration took 18 hours instead of expected 4 hours, causing significant customer-facing downtime and service disruption. Major client complained about extended outage, threatening to leave platform due to reliability concerns. CTO called emergency meeting asking why critical infrastructure knowledge had been concentrated in one person who was now gone. Engineering leadership explained Nathan had been sole expert on several legacy systems, and his departure created crisis. I explained Nathan had been terminated for cultural fit issues, specifically his quietness and lack of verbal participation. CTO seemed shocked, asking if I'd terminated employee managing critical infrastructure because he was introverted. Said Nathan's quietness wasn't the issue. His refusal to engage with collaborative culture was the problem. CTO said Nathan's job was managing infrastructure, not talking in meetings. Asked what actual performance problems justified termination. I explained performance wasn't just technical work. Cultural engagement and verbal participation were essential for collaboration. CTO said Nathan's detailed documentation and prompt responses to questions suggested he'd been collaborating just fine in writing. That terminating infrastructure expert for being quiet rather than actual performance issues seemed like catastrophic HR failure. For weeks after termination, company had spent over $60,000 on consultants addressing infrastructure issues Nathan would have handled. Customer complaints about system reliability had increased dramatically due to multiple outages and degraded performance. Major client who'd threatened to leave had signed with competitor, citing infrastructure instability as primary reason. Loss of major client represented $400,000 in annual recurring revenue directly traceable to infrastructure problems. Engineering team was struggling to maintain systems Nathan had managed while also trying to hire replacement. But hiring senior infrastructure engineer with Nathan's experience was proving difficult given competitive market. CTO called meeting with CEO and board presenting analysis of infrastructure crisis following Nathan's termination. Said company had lost critical infrastructure knowledge when I'd terminated Nathan for cultural fit issues. That's $60,000 in consultant costs for $100,000 in lost client revenue. And ongoing instability were direct results of that termination. And that hiring replacement for Nathan would take minimum 3 to 4 months, with salary likely $30,000 higher than Nathan's. CEO asked me directly what specific performance issues had justified terminating 9-year infrastructure expert. I explained Nathan had been extremely quiet, didn't participate verbally in meetings, and didn't embrace collaborative culture. CEO asked if there had been problems with his technical work, project delivery, or collaboration when people reached out. I admitted technical work had been fine. He'd just been too quiet and introverted for culture we were building. CEO seemed incredulous, asking if I'd understood Nathan was managing critical infrastructure before terminating him. Said I'd known about infrastructure role, but believed cultural fit was important enough to outweigh technical expertise. Board member asked if I'd consulted with engineering leadership about impact before terminating critical infrastructure employee. I said HR decisions about cultural fit didn't require engineering approval. Termination had been my decision based on engagement concerns. Board member said terminating employee managing critical systems without consulting technical leadership showed catastrophic judgment. 2 months after termination, company had experienced 5 major infrastructure incidents requiring consultant intervention. Total consultant costs had reached $95,000, addressing issues Nathan would have prevented or resolved quickly. Customer churn had accelerated with 3 additional clients, citing reliability concerns in exit interviews. Lost revenue from departed clients had reached $650,000 annually, with infrastructure instability mentioned in all cases. Engineering team had interviewed 12 candidates for Nathan's role, but none had experience with specific legacy systems. Best candidate would require $140,000 salary versus Nathan's $110,000 plus estimated 6 months to reach Nathan's expertise level. Meanwhile, infrastructure continued experiencing problems that wouldn't have occurred under Nathan's experienced management. CTO presented comprehensive analysis to board showing total cost of Nathan's termination approaching $1 million, including consultant fees, lost revenue, recruiting costs, salary premium for replacement, and ongoing system instability. Recommended that board review HR's authority to terminate technical employees without consulting engineering leadership. 3 months after termination, board called special meeting to review my decision to terminate Nathan. Said termination of critical infrastructure expert for being too quiet had created company-threatening crisis. That engineering leadership had never been consulted despite Nathan managing systems essential to business operations. And that my focus on verbal participation over technical contribution showed fundamental misunderstanding of engineering roles. Asked if I understood difference between roles requiring extroversion and technical roles where quiet, focused work was valuable. I defended decisions saying all employees should embrace collaborative culture regardless of their specific role. That Nathan's quietness had prevented team from understanding his work and collaborating effectively. Board member asked engineering leaders if Nathan's quietness had actually prevented collaboration on technical work. Engineering director said Nathan had been extremely collaborative through written documentation and prompt responses. That his detailed technical writing was far more valuable than verbal updates in meetings for infrastructure work. Another engineer said Nathan's preference for documentation over talking had actually made collaboration easier, because everything was written down and searchable rather than requiring remembering verbal conversations. Board concluded that my termination of Nathan had been based on personal preference for extroversion, not legitimate performance issues. 4 months after termination, board voted to terminate my employment as HR director for catastrophic judgment in Nathan's termination. Said decision to fire critical infrastructure employee for being introverted had cost company approaching $1 million. That failure to consult engineering leadership before terminating technical employees showed incompetence. And that insistence verbal participation mattered more than technical excellence was disqualifying for HR leadership. Received termination notice citing poor judgment, failure to understand technical roles, and creating million-dollar crisis. Felt devastated being fired for what I believed was appropriate focus on collaborative culture and employee engagement. Posted on social media about being terminated for prioritizing culture and holding employee accountable for participation. Got very mixed responses, with some HR professionals supporting cultural focus and others saying I'd made obvious mistake. One commenter said, "You fired infrastructure expert for being quiet, then infrastructure collapsed. That's not culture, it's incompetence." Another said some jobs require quiet, focused work. Demanding extroversion from engineer managing systems shows you don't understand roles. Started therapy to process termination and understand how cultural focus had become million-dollar crisis. Therapist asked me to describe what problems Nathan's quietness had actually caused for his work or team. I said he didn't participate verbally in meetings and didn't attend full social events, showing lack of engagement. She asked if his quietness had prevented him from doing infrastructure work or responding when team needed information. I was quiet because I couldn't identify actual work problems, only that his quietness hadn't matched cultural preferences. She said, "It sounds like you decided quietness itself was problem regardless of whether it affected his work." That Nathan's detailed documentation and prompt responses suggested he'd been collaborating effectively in his preferred style. And that terminating employee for personality trait rather than performance had predictably resulted in crisis. This was painful realization that I'd prioritized personal preference for extroversion over actual job performance. Started thinking about Nathan's 9 years managing critical infrastructure and what I'd failed to consider. His extensive documentation had been his way of collaborating and sharing information with team. His prompt responses to questions showed he was available and helpful when approached. His technical excellence maintaining complex systems for 9 years proved his competence and value. But I decided his quietness was disqualifying cultural problem without considering whether it actually impacted his work. 6 months after my termination, company had finally hired Nathan's replacement at $145,000 salary. New hire required 4 months of intensive training with consultants to understand legacy systems Nathan had managed. During training period, another major infrastructure failure occurred that Nathan would have prevented through routine maintenance. Failure caused 24-hour outage affecting all customers and generating significant negative press about platform reliability. 3 additional major clients departed, citing infrastructure instability and unreliability following multiple outages. Total lost annual revenue from departed clients had reached $980,000, all traceable to infrastructure problems after Nathan's termination. Company's valuation had decreased as investors became concerned about technical leadership and infrastructure stability. Year after Nathan's termination, published article about experience titled "I Fired Quiet Engineer and Infrastructure Collapsed." Detailed how I'd terminated Nathan for being too quiet, without considering his technical expertise or critical role. That infrastructure crisis following his departure had cost company approaching $1.5 million in direct and indirect costs. And that board had terminated me for catastrophic judgment prioritizing extroversion over technical competence. Article went viral in tech community with over 800K reads and intense debate about personality versus performance. Many engineering leaders appreciated cautionary tale about HR misunderstanding technical roles. One CTO commented essential warning about how HR focusing on personality over performance destroys technical organizations. Another commented firing infrastructure expert for being quiet is textbook example of valuing extroversion over competence. But some HR professionals defended cultural focus, saying engagement and collaboration mattered across all roles. 2 years after termination, ran into Nathan, who'd found new position managing infrastructure at larger company. He said termination had been devastating after 9 years of dedicated work maintaining critical systems. That being fired for being too quiet rather than performance had made him question his value and career. New employer appreciated his technical expertise and detailed documentation style without demanding verbal performance. I apologized for terminating him based on personality preference rather than actual work performance. He said he hoped my experience helped other HR professionals understand that different roles required different communication styles. That infrastructure work requiring quiet, focused attention was different from sales requiring constant verbal interaction. 3 years after termination reflected on how focus on collaborative culture had destroyed critical infrastructure. Realized biggest mistake had been assuming all employees should communicate same way regardless of role requirements. That Nathan's quietness hadn't prevented collaboration, his documentation and responsiveness had enabled it. And that terminating critical infrastructure expert without consulting engineering had been catastrophically incompetent. Started consulting work helping companies distinguish between personality preferences and actual performance problems. Main message was that Nathan's termination had cost company $1.5 million because I'd valued extroversion over technical excellence. That different roles required different communication styles, and quiet, focused work was valuable for technical positions. One consulting client had HR leader planning to terminate quiet software architect for not speaking in meetings. My experience convinced them that architects' technical work and written documentation mattered more than verbal participation. Another client had been pressuring introverted engineers to attend all social events under threat of cultural fit concerns. Worked with them on understanding that social preferences didn't determine technical competence or collaboration ability. 4 years after termination, published book about experience, wanting to help HR professionals understand technical roles. Detailed complete story from observing Nathan's quietness to termination to infrastructure collapse to million-dollar crisis. Included analysis from engineering leaders about how quiet, focused work was essential for complex technical roles, and framework for evaluating performance based on work quality and collaboration outcomes, not personality preferences. Book became required reading in HR programs as case study about misunderstanding technical work and role requirements. 5 years after termination, company had finally stabilized infrastructure but never fully recovered from crisis. Total estimated cost of Nathan's termination, including consultant fees, lost revenue, reputation damage, approached $2.3 million. Company had implemented policy requiring engineering leadership approval before terminating any technical employees, and had revised performance expectations to focus on work outcomes rather than participation style or personality. Current reflection 7 years after terminating too quiet man and watching infrastructure collapse. Learned that Nathan's quietness hadn't prevented him from managing critical infrastructure for 9 years. That his detailed documentation and prompt responses had enabled collaboration in his preferred style. That terminating him for not matching extroverted cultural preference rather than performance was incompetent. That infrastructure crisis costing $2.3 was predictable result of firing expert without considering technical impact. Most importantly, that different roles required different communication styles, and valuing extroversion over competence was disqualifying. That's what I learned from terminating quiet infrastructure expert and watching projects collapse. From demanding verbal participation to understanding quiet, focused work was valuable for technical roles. From cultural fit obsession to recognizing performance and collaboration outcomes mattered more than personality. That's my complete story about terminating Quiet Man and learning why personality preferences don't outweigh technical expertise. 7 years after termination, continued consulting, helping companies avoid valuing personality over performance. Most impactful work involved HR professionals recognizing themselves, demanding extroversion from technical employees. One HR director had been terminating quiet engineers for not participating enough in all-hands meetings. After hearing complete story, understood technical work required focused quiet time, not constant verbal participation. Revised performance expectations to focus on code quality and collaboration outcomes rather than meeting participation. Another HR leader had been requiring introverted developers to attend all social events under cultural fit policy. Worked with them on understanding social preferences, didn't determine technical competence or team collaboration. 8 years after termination, published follow-up research on personality bias in performance evaluation. Studied 250 companies comparing technical employee performance to participation styles and extroversion levels. Found that quiet, focused employees often outperformed extroverted ones in complex technical roles requiring deep concentration. That companies valuing verbal participation over technical outcomes had higher turnover and worse technical performance. Research validated that demanding extroversion from Nathan had been bias undermining companies' technical excellence. 9 years after termination, Nathan's replacement had finally reached Nathan's expertise level with legacy systems. Process had taken 4 years and cost over $400,000 in training, consultants, and salary premium. Engineering leadership said they'd never replace employee managing critical systems without careful succession planning again. That Nathan's termination had taught expensive lesson about valuing technical expertise over personality preferences. Current reflection 10 years after terminating Quiet Man and watching infrastructure collapse costing millions. Learned that decade of helping companies avoid personality bias gave some meaning to catastrophic mistake. That Nathan's quietness had been his working style, not indicator of disengagement or poor performance. That infrastructure collapse was predictable when firing expert without considering technical dependencies. That $2.3 million total cost plus my termination were appropriate consequences for prioritizing extroversion over competence. Most importantly, that different roles required different communication styles, and one-size-fits-all cultural expectations destroyed value. That's everything learned from 10 years since terminating Quiet Engineer and watching infrastructure collapse. From demanding all employees be extroverted to understanding quiet, focused work was valuable for technical roles. From cultural fit obsession to recognizing technical excellence mattered more than personality preferences. That's my final lesson about terminating Quiet Man and learning why valuing participation over performance destroys companies. 10 years after termination, continued consulting work helping technical companies avoid personality bias in performance evaluation. Most powerful sessions involved HR leaders recognizing themselves, demanding extroversion from roles requiring focused concentration. One tech startup had CEO insisting all engineers participate actively in daily stand-up meetings, showing engagement. After hearing complete story about Nathan and infrastructure collapse, understood that forced participation disrupted deep technical work. Revised expectations allowing engineers to submit written updates, preserving focus time for complex problem solving. Company reported 40% increase in code quality and project completion rates after reducing mandatory verbal participation requirements. Another software company had HR director planning to terminate 3 quiet senior engineers for poor cultural engagement. Worked with engineering leadership on demonstrating those 3 engineers were top performers in code quality and system reliability. HR director understood terminating them would create knowledge gaps similar to crisis Nathan's departure had caused. Company implemented dual-track performance evaluation recognizing technical excellence and collaborative effectiveness separately. 11 years after termination, published comprehensive guide for evaluating technical employees without personality bias. Detailed framework distinguishing between collaboration outcomes and participation style preferences in performance assessment. Included my case as primary example of how valuing extroversion over technical competence created catastrophic business outcomes. And research showing quiet, focused employees often outperformed extroverted ones in complex technical roles requiring concentration. Guide became an essential resource for HR professionals working in technical organizations learning to value outcomes over personality. Started mentoring HR professionals specifically about understanding different communication styles in technical versus client-facing roles. One new HR director at engineering company wanted to implement participation requirements across all departments. After our work together understood that engineers managing complex systems needed quiet focus time, not constant meetings. Developed role-specific performance expectations valuing technical outcomes for engineers and client engagement for sales teams. Another HR professional had been pressuring introverted data scientists to be more vocal in team meetings. Helped her recognize that data science requiring deep analytical thinking benefited from quiet, focused work style. She revised approach measuring collaboration through quality of analysis and responsiveness rather than meeting participation. Current reflection 12 years after terminating two quiet engineer and watching infrastructure collapse costing millions. Learned that 12 years of helping companies value technical competence over personality preferences gave meaning to failure. That Nathan's quietness had enabled 9 years of excellent infrastructure management through focused attention and detailed documentation. That demanding he become extroverted had ignored reality that different roles required different communication styles. That infrastructure collapse costing $2.3 million plus my termination were directly traceable to prioritizing personality over performance. Most importantly, that technical excellence in quiet, focused employees deserved recognition, not termination for cultural fit. That's my complete final reflection from 12 years since terminating quiet man and learning expensive lesson about personality bias.